Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for the Seat of Sacrifice Extreme. This is the newest Extreme trial made available by patch 5.3 and Final Fantasy XIV, Reflections in Crystal. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your raid guide. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some tips on how to assign positions for this fight. First, you'll want to assign clock positions for all players. Tanks will be north and south, while the two healers are east and west. The damage dealers will all have their own intercardinal position. These general positions will be used throughout the entire encounter for various mechanics. Second, have each tank and healer rotate clockwise to pair up with a damage dealer at an intercardinal. These will be your partner pairs for shared mechanics that target specific groups of players or roles. Lastly, you'll need to split the group into two, specifically with each healer on either side. This will be for specific shared damage mechanics. Assigning these positions in advance will allow for less headaches and consistent handling of similar mechanics. Now that that's out of the way, let's take a look at the actual fight. The encounter begins with Terror Unleashed, which will bring all player health pools down to 1 and limit the outer edge of the arena. Each player will also be afflicted with the true Walking Dead debuff and must be healed to full before their timer runs out or they will die. Healers be ready with those burst heals. Anytime the boss casts to the limit, his LB bar will appear above his head and he'll charge 1, 2, or 3 bars. The number of bars charged up will determine the specific attack players will need to be ready for when he next casts Limit Break. In this case, he's rocking an LB3, which will cause Radiant Meteor to target 4 players. However, it'll be a bit of time before that limit break goes off, so you can ignore it for now. Next up, Solemn Confidier will place AoE circles underneath all players. To control where these drop, we have all players stack underneath the boss. This is followed by Absolute Stone 3, an 8-point cleave that will target every single player. To avoid overlap, we use the assigned clock positions for all players. As soon as the Confidier circles drop, all players can quickly move into their assigned spread positions. Immediately after, the boss will cast Limit Break. Limit Break 3 will call down 4 Radiant Meteors on all the tanks and healers, or all the damage dealers. This attack deals massive damage and applies a fire resist down debuff on players hit, so each meteor needs to be sufficiently spaced apart or you will die. To handle this, we use the player pairs formed by the tanks and healers rotating clockwise into each intercardinal. Each partner pair will then move into their respective corners as Limit Break is casting to drop their meteor as far away as possible from everyone else. As soon as the cast completes, players can return to the boss. Next up, the boss will leap into the center and begin to cast Imbued Saber. On Extreme, there are 4 elements that can be imbued, and all 4 have different mechanics associated with them. Here, the boss will always cast Absolute Stone 3 imbuement first. The second Imbued Saber can be either Absolute Fire or Absolute Blizzard, and these work in the same manner as normal mode, but without the obvious markers above each player's head. Players will have to watch carefully and remember which of the 2 elements have been imbued. The boss will then cast Imbued Coruscants. The Coruscant part of the attack will have the boss throwing out either a point-blank AoE or donut attack. The imbued parts will cause the 2 specific elemental imbuement mechanics to apply at the same time as this AoE attack. Players will again need to watch his sword very closely. If you notice a swirling effect around his sword as he's casting imbued Coruscants, you'll need to move into the hitbox to avoid the incoming donut attack. If there is no swirl and all you see are the 2 orbs signifying the 2 elemental imbuements, you'll need to move away from the boss to avoid the incoming point-blank AoE. As players move in or out to avoid the sword attack, they must also take into consideration the 2 elemental imbuements. Since we know that this first imbuement is always stone, all players will need to stay in their assigned spread positions regardless of whether they're in or out. Then, in those same assigned spots, they'll need to handle the second elemental imbuement at the same time. If it was Absolute Blizzard, all players must continuously move around in their spots to avoid getting ice blocked. If it was Absolute Fire, all players must refrain from moving or attacking at the end of the cast to avoid triggering excess pyretic damage. Once pyretic falls off, they can resume their attack. Next, the boss will cast another To the Limit, this time charging up 2 bars. Immediately after, Sword of Light will spawn 3 swords around the outer edges that will begin to draw 3 triangles across the platform from their starting position. The patterns created here will always form safe zones on one edge of the platform. An easy way to quickly identify the safe side is by eliminating any side that has had a line drawn down its length by its sword. All players will need to move outside of the 3 patterns drawn by the sword. At the same time, a player will be marked for Absolute Holy with this stack up marker. Stand together to soak that damage as the Sword of Light triangles are resolving. Immediately after, the boss will cast Limit Break 2. This attack will target each healer for Radiant Desperado, a shared line attack that deals high damage and applies a physical vulnerability up debuff on anyone hit. To handle this, we divide the group into 2, ensuring that each healer is on their own side of the boss to avoid overlapping the 2 Desperado attacks. The boss will cast a final To the Limit, this time time charging up only 1 bar. Next, another round of imbued sabers will occur. Luckily for us, this round is essentially the opposite of what the first round of imbuements was, so it's quite easy to predict and pre-position for. The first imbuement in this second round will always be Absolute Holy, which will require all players to stack together to share the damage. The second imbuement will be Absolute Fire or Blizzard, whichever of the two wasn't in the first round. The following imbued Coruscants will also be the opposite of what it was in the first round. So if it was in originally, this time it will be out, or vice versa. Position appropriately for the end of the imbued Coruscant's cast, and remember to either stop or move as necessary. Next up, the boss will cast Limit Break 1. This attack will target 1 random tank, 1 random healer, and 1 random damage dealer with Radiant Braver dealing high damage that, you guessed it, you don't want to overlap. Since there is no way to predict who exactly this attack will target, we split and separate the group based on role. Both tanks will stand on the north side of the boss while all the damage dealers stay directly south. The healers can go either east or west or stay together on one of those two sides. As long as every player is in their assigned role spot, there should be no overlap. The bitter end is a heavy hitting tank buster that also applies a physical vulnerability up debuff lasting 15 seconds. Heavy cooldowns and a tank swap will be required here. Next up, Summon Worm will bring down Bahamut on one of the north edge sides. At the same time, all players will be targeted for Confiteor AoE circles, and one player will be marked for a gaze attack that will afflict players with damage down. To handle this combo, players can stack up on the boss again to neatly stack the Confiteor circles. As soon as Bahamut drops on one side, the Confiteor circles will also appear, and players can all immediately move to the safe side of the boss away from where Bahamut will be dive bombing. All players will stay in melee range while the gaze player moves to max melee range on the same side. This allows all players to keep wailing on the boss without worrying about where the gaze attack is coming from. Dragon Dive will deal high raid-wide damage. Healers beware. At this point, the boss will move to the north and cast Spectre of Light, marking the beginning of the ad phase. A Spectral Warrior and Dark Knight ad will spawn in the east and west. These two ads will be picked up by each tank and pulled apart, where they will get tethered and buff each other. These ads will periodically cast a heavy hitting tank buster that should be mitigated as necessary. They also cast Berserk, which will need to be interrupted or you will probably die. After the two tank ads spawn, the Spectral Bard will target all damage dealers with flare markers. These players will use their assigned corners to spread their flares apart as far as possible to minimize damage. The Spectral Black and White mages will call down meteor towers in the east and west that must be soaked by 2 players each. At this time, each healer will also be targeted for Radiant Holy, which they must share with one other person to survive. To handle this combo, once the flare markers go off on all the damage dealers, we have the melee stand with their tank in a meteor tower, while the ranged run to their healer partner to share the damage. This allows the melee and tanks to maintain their uptime on the ads. While this is happening, the Spectral Summoner will bring down 4 Bahamuts in each corner of the room. These Bahamuts will tether to random players and eventually throw out massive breath attacks in the direction of the tethered players. As soon as the meteor tower and the healer stacks are soaked, we assign each healer and ranged player to a Bahamut tether and have them turn their Bahamuts towards their corner to avoid excess overlap. The melee and tanks are free here to burn down the tank ads. There is a lot of raid damage going out during this combo, so healers will have to be ready with shields and heals before the heavy damage hits of each mechanic step go off. After the breaths, the Bahamuts will leave and the entire group is free to return their focus on the remaining tank ads. You'll have before the boss hits 100 on his limit break gauge to destroy the 2 ads. If you are successful, the next phase will begin. During the transition, the boss will charge up limit break 4. To survive this, you'll need your own tank limit break 3 and other mitigation. Heal through the damage and wait for the boss to reactivate. In this phase, the rotation of mechanics will vary based on the specific specters of light the boss will summon. While there's no strict order of which specters are summoned, there is instead a total of 4 strict specter combos that ultimately create mini phases with specific mechanics. In between these specter mini phases, players will be dealing with the same mechanics they learned in the first phase, but with increasingly difficult overlap. Players will need to be very careful at identifying what imbuements and limit breaks to expect, as there is often a good chunk of mechanics between the initial cast and the final resolution of the mechanic. Anytime you see an imbuement or to the limit cast, keep that information in the back of your mind until it's time to use it. Let's look at each possible specter combo and the resultant mini phases they create and how to handle them in order of difficulty. The easiest combo is the ninja. As soon as the spectral ninja appears, all players can stack in the middle of the boss to bait the incoming Confiteor circles. As soon as those circles appear, each player pair will move to their assigned intercardinal positions around the boss. At this time, the ninja's water spout knockback is about to occur. To keep things simple, all players can use their knockback immunity here to stay put. As the knockback is occurring, 4 absolute holy markers will go out, but since everyone is already positioned with their partner at their assigned intercardinals, there's no need for excess movement. Stand together to share the damage. Once the damage goes off, the ninja will disappear and the mini phase is over. Now let's look at the White Mage Black Mage combo. In this mini phase, 8 total meteor towers will spawn in quick succession. Each meteor tower must be soaked by at least 2 players or they will explode and you will die. To handle this in an organized manner, we have the 2 healers always take the first meteor wherever it spawns. The second meteor to spawn will be handled by both tanks, the third by both melee, and the fourth by both ranged. With the timing of the tower spawns, as the first meteor tower is resolving, the 5th meteor tower is spawning. This will again be handled by the 2 healers, the 6th by the 2 tanks, the 7th by the 2 melee, and the 8th by the 2 ranged. This controlled order of healer, tank, melee, and range should make it easy for each player pair to quickly recognize which meteor they are responsible for. Once all meteor towers are resolved, the mini phase concludes. Let's take a look at the Dark Knight Bard combo. This again starts off with Confiteor circles dropping underneath all players. Stand by the boss to neatly control the AoE circles. The Dark Knight will then target all damage dealers with Brimstone Earth circle markers that will eventually have them dropping orbs that grow over time. Should these orbs touch, they will explode and you will die. As such, affected damage dealers will need to run far into their assigned corners to drop off their orbs. As the orbs begin to grow in each corner, the Spectral Bard will mark up a player with the Absolute Holy stack-up marker, and 1 tank, 1 healer, and 1 damage dealer with Deluge of Death flare markers. To handle this with the limited area around the growing orbs, we use the same role positions assignments as the first phase to drop off the flare markers at the edge of the platform. Tanks will run north, damage dealers south, and the healers either east or west. All other players will remain in the center to stack and share the Absolute Holy damage. Once all of these attacks go off, this mini phase concludes. Lastly, the Summoner Warrior combo. This one is slightly easier to predict before the specters actually spawn because the boss will leap slightly north before casting Spectre of Light. 4 Bahamut's will appear in each corner, eventually tether to a player and flare breath in their direction. At the same time, the Spectral Warrior will target 4 players with orange perfect decimation markers before blasting a 4-point cleave in their direction. All of these mechanics go off at the same time, so we need to avoid overlap. Since at first we don't know who is going to get what marker, we start off by moving into our assigned corner pairs. The Bahamut tethers will always apply first, and then a short moment later the orange tethers will appear. Whichever of the 2 partners doesn't have the orange marker will grab the Bahamut tether and turn them to face the corner. The partner with the orange marker will then move into the cardinal clockwise from their assigned corner. However, before these 2 attacks go off, Confiteor circles will appear under all players, so make sure you don't box yourself in. Start to position for your tether or marker, and as soon as the Confiteor circle appears underneath you, you can finalize your position before the attacks go off. Next, a second round of the same marker, but this time they'll swap to the opposite player in each pair. The player pairs can meet up at their Bahamut to transfer their tether and drop their Confiteor circles off before pre-positioning appropriately for each attack. Once this final round of attacks goes off, the mini phase concludes. All 4 Spectre mini phases will play out before the boss enrages. In between these mini phases, players will have to recognize and adjust for the specific elemental imbuements and to the limit charges the boss casts. You'll notice that generally the charge or imbuement will occur just before a mini phase, and as soon as the Spectre mini phase ends, that charge or imbuement will then resolve. Players will have to remember what the original cast was, hold that in their memory as they handle the Spectre mini phase before applying it afterwards. The one new mechanic to look out for in this phase is Quintuple Cast, which will always follow the very first Spectre mini phase, so be ready. This cast will first show players the telegraphs of the 5 mechanics that will occur, before applying the same mechanics in succession without any telegraphs. The order of these mechanics will be random, but players can always expect one of the following 5 attacks: stack, spread, stop, move, and gaze. Players will need to rely on their memory to maneuver these mechanics in turn, or you will probably die. Immediately after Quintuple Cast, Sword of Light will again form 3 triangle patterns on the platform, and players must identify and move into the safe side to avoid death. The drawing of each pattern is much faster than in the first phase, so make sure you're paying attention. You'll also deal with more Eldragon dives, tank busters, and summon worms throughout this phase, but by this point I'm sure you know how to handle them. As stated before, the boss needs to run through all 4 mini phases before Enrage, so you have plenty of time to burn him down. As long as you're handling each mini phase in turn with minimal deaths, you should have him down in no time. Do remember that each time you start this encounter, the order of mechanics in the final phase can change, and it's more important for you to understand how to handle each mechanic in turn than it is for you to memorize the scripted rotation that we've all come to expect. Have fun with it. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.